our lunch date with history, which we do every first Friday of every month. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Many of you know him because he has done lots of talks here. And I just saw his schedule up there on the screen a little while ago. It looks like he's doing a whole bunch of talks all over the place, but popular guy. Former teacher. We worked together in the school system, actually. And this is my honor to introduce Lee Preston.
Okay, it's nice to be here at the lunch lecture today. Everybody lunched out? Got your carbohydrates? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about garbage today. I hope that doesn't upset you too much. I don't know what comes into mind when you hear the word garbage. Once a week, maybe twice a week, that does. In archaeology, I found out over the years, other people's garbage that you're excavating when you're doing subsurface excavations in a very systematic, controlled way to reconstruct the past. All of a sudden, and of course, archaeology is a method at getting into the past to be able to explain it. And basically, artifacts and remains, I guess that becomes the garbage that we're excavating. And when you have a vertical profile like the one here, this particular prehistoric site in Anne Arundel County, we're talking 8,000 years from the top to the bottom of this particular square. So it's kind of neat when you're doing, when you're able to reconstruct what went on in each of those levels in time. Other people's garbage title, Dr. James Dietz had a video clip that I looked at many years ago. By the way, James Dietz was born in Maryland, in Cumberland, Maryland. He was a professor at the University of Virginia, and you'll raise your hand if I'm either too loud or not loud enough, right? His famous book, Small Things Forgotten, was about historic archaeology in this country. And the title, Small Things Forgotten, is, again, size matters. In this case, there were oftentimes archaeologists who, when they were doing excavations, they looked for the big stuff. They didn't necessarily worry about the small stuff. And some other archaeologists, if they were doing historic excavations, and they found prehistoric stuff, they discarded it. They didn't worry about it. James Dietz said everything that we find needs to be included, needs to be kept, no matter how small or how inconsequential you think it is. Now all of a sudden garbage became middens. This is a shell midden. On the left, a kitchen midden. I met Eric Dietz, his son, in Virginia at Jamestown a number of years ago, in 1999, when they were doing excavations at obviously a very iconic site. At the time, they weren't sure how much was there, but this is, they did reconstruct the fort, the palisade around the fort, and also this, this bulwark where they would have a cabin. There were 3 bulwarks at the site, 2 facing out to the water and 1 facing inland for protection. And again, lots of large artifacts as well as small artifacts, trade beads. And the site over time has been written about for sure. You found all kinds of interesting information. And as I said, also the post molds for the fort. And this is Eric back in 1999, showing one of the post molds or post holes. There's a post hole would be dug in order to put a post in the hole. So the post hole was first, and then the darker spot in the middle is the post mold. That would be where the post decomposed, and over time, you have a darker stain there. So oftentimes when you're doing archaeology, you're looking for those stains in the soil. And in some cases, they're post molds. And And this is the group that took down some of my college students, high school students, middle school students that were involved in the Upper Patuxent Archaeology group, and members of the Archaeological Society of Maryland, 28 of us. They allowed us to come down and dig for a few days. And that's Bill Kelso, who's the head man. He's been there obviously from 1994, so it's over 30 years of doing archaeology at the site. And my wife-to-be, who I had met a few weeks before that, invited her to go on the trip, and we wound up getting married a few years later. So she also found some trade beads, and two of them, in fact, that was pretty exciting for that particular couple of days we were there. She also contracted one of 3 people that had Lyme's disease, and one of them had Rocky Mountain spotted fever toxin. So it still was an interesting place to be. You probably heard of some of the stories about the early days of Jamestown, people dying. So we were still protected though with proper antitoxins. Anyway, that's a pretty iconic site. And we were working close to the Captain John Smith statue, obviously inside the fort, closer to one of the bulwarks. And we dug there for a couple of days. Actually, using pickaxes is okay in archaeology if you're in between particular levels. And everybody there from ages 14 to 65 had a really good time in those 2 days there, and finding a variety of artifacts, small and clay, including these beads at the bottom. These are mussel shell Native American beads, and pieces of 8 that can be the Spanish coin can be broken into 2 bits. Is a quarter, yeah. Also, some bone dies or dice, and of course some lithic or stone artifacts. Many of the artifacts were found in an abandoned well. In fact, 500,000 in the years that it took to excavate. And water screening helps you get at those little artifacts so they're not lost to mankind. Those are some of the mussel shell beads the Native Americans made. And thank goodness, small things not forgotten. And the bone, that's a dog mandible. You can see some cut marks on it. You've probably heard in Jamestown of the starving time between 1609 and 1610. They were eating some of the animals that were domesticated. And there are some burials there that have been, some of the individuals have been identified. And you perhaps have read about that, but Douglas Owsley from, who's now the chief archaeologist, or not archaeologist, the physical anthropology, director of physical anthropology at Smithsonian Institution. And so that's a pretty iconic site. And interestingly enough, so the iconic artifacts there, the dice and the bone, also found them at a site very close to where we are today, the Capsco Female Institute, in a kitchen midden. And that bone did have cut marks on it, but it wasn't, and it was a steer bone. It was part of the kitchen midden there at the Institute. I give talks on specifically on that. I have a couple of different lectures on the archaeology there, but it is a pretty, obviously iconic site. It wasn't real pretty when I started there in 1988. It was obviously better when it was a hotel around early 1900s, the Bird Alnwick Hotel. In present day, it's still, I guess they're doing tours up there. I think Shakespeare in the Ruins is still there. So it has been preserved. So some of the iconic structures inside of it can be interpreted. And that's where the kitchen midden was. They could walk out of the basement and dump trash in that area. In fact, out of the 67,000 artifacts that were initially found there, over half of them were found in what we call the kitchen midden. That's just part of it. And it has really some help from Naomi Lewis, who is now a speech audiologist, but she was minoring in archaeology. And Lisa Brody, who is also a Howard County student that got her degree in archaeology and is now works at the, I think she's now the director of or assistant curator of the Ancient Art Museum at Yale University. So they were very helpful in the early days of doing archaeology at the Institute. Some of the iconic items that were found, this chamber pot lid, and they did have gravity-fed plumbing for #1, but #2s were done in their individual rooms, and so there were chamber pots at the Institute back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And that's not where they were dumped in this particular area here, but this is a site that's not stratified. It's been heavily disturbed over time, but there are lots of artifacts in it, and in a fairly large area, as I said, and we could find artifacts in there dating from the 1830s to the 1950s, kind of mixed together, like that inkwell base. And also the, anybody recognize that? That's a clay pigeon. Interestingly enough, of course, clay pigeons present day, a lot of them are arms, they're shot out, oh, and you fire it and you try to break it with a shotgun. That was an activity, a recreational activity at the Berg-on-Wick Hotel, in the back of the hotel, the north side of the hotel, because we found a lot of those bits and pieces. And the inkwell, that was what's called a hand-blown inkwell base. That's where the pontil was attached before it was broken off while it was hand-blown. Other inkwells were found there that were blown in mold. So there's a lot of interesting iconic 18th or 19th century artifacts there. And some of the others are shown in here, including the dye and pipes that I'm sure the men that smoked there, I don't think the young ladies were smoking pipes at the time, as well as a toothbrush. And that is a particular artifact that's pretty iconic that was found in one of the test pits that we were digging. And a few minutes once that was found, all of a sudden people became very cautious about what they were digging. We found two in that one square at the site, and that was dated to considered to be late Etruscan revival jewelry to the 1860s. That was an expert at Smithsonian dated that, so it was a gold with a turquoise stone, and that's the number of the square it was found in. At 18 HO 143, the site number. And that's where it was found, possibly because that was sewn into a dress. So it's possible that the young lady was walking around and it fell off one of her gold pendants. Anyway, there's also a lot of different types of pottery found at the site, earthenware, stoneware, and even some porcelain. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. I'm going to jump from that site to a prehistoric site, prehistoric pottery. This is the first site that I officially logged in when it came to Howard County, site 18HO51. There had already been 50 sites in Howard County, and now there are over 300 But 51 was the first one, and it might not look like much, but that was a piece of Indian pottery, and it was found out in Clarksville, out on a farm. And basically in pottery, what we generally don't find is a complete pot, but when they were making this particular pottery, it was shell-tempered pottery. So they took oyster shell or mussel shell, broke it up, mixed it in with the clay, and that's what gives the pottery, when it's fired, it allows it to not to break as easily. The thing is that over time, the shell leaches out. So even though that doesn't look like much of an artifact, to me it was very important because it's a piece of shell-tempered pottery that we found. And again, we didn't find any complete pots, lots of pieces. And it was identified as Mockley ware, that particular pottery. Another interesting artifact, we'll move from pottery to lithics, was this Morrow Mountain Point. A young lady brought it in to one of my archaeology meetings and said she had found it in her backyard in the stream, middle Patuxent River behind her house. And that was dated to about 4,500 to 6,000 BP, before present. It was made of rhyolite, and there it is on the characteristic artifacts of Maryland. So it's pretty neat artifact. Now we'll get rid of the rhyolite. We're going to move to historic times with iron ore, charcoal, and limestone being added to a large furnace in layers. And that's the iron furnace industry that is pretty important in Howard County. Of course, then it was Anne Arundel County, and even parts of it were in Baltimore County. But iron furnaces were pretty important in the early 1700s, obviously into the 19th century. And the first one in what's present-day Howard County was in 1756, Caleb Dorsey's furnace. And they were creating pig iron. The pig iron was, they used they used the metaphor, okay, Lee. They used the sow, the piglets metaphor. The furnace was the sow, and the pig iron was the piglets. So that's why I got the name pig iron. Of course, when it cooled and hardened, they were kind of grayish in color. And I was able to find, in fact, this is 3 years ago, it was the first time I found the actual condemnation record of Caleb Dorsey on a run, and that's what I have to walk in front of. Usually I stand right behind my computer there, on a run of water near the dwelling house of Caleb Dorsey, and running into Patapsco Falls. And I've actually walked it. It's basically a rock burn ranch. I've walked the site. And his brother, and also Alexander Lawson, who was an iron master, they went in partnership on this particular site on Rockburn Ranch. And on the next page, it mentioned that the purpose of it was for building a forge mill for producing pig iron. Also, that same, well, not the same year, but 2 years later, a gentleman by the name of Dr. James Walker also got a condemnation read. I'm sorry, there's so much brightness in that light there coming in, but he also condemned 100 acres, but you were allowed to do, you wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. Another 100-acre parcel that was on Stony Run. That's here on Stony Run, to build for the purpose of building a pig iron furnace. And that's where his particular he had purchased a lot of land. He already had thousands of acres, but he purchased this 3,500 acre parcel, and that's where his furnace was, and that's where the the Caleb Dorsey furnace was on Rockburn Branch, about a mile and a half apart. Interestingly enough, that some other iconic documents where the Maryland Gazette would have advertisements where, in this case, Caleb Dorsey was looking for some runaways from his furnace. Oftentimes, the furnace owners had slaves and/or indentured servants. So Maryland had the most convicts of any other colonies sent over from Britain. And so a lot of the convicts worked off their time by being, their contract was purchased by a landowner. And in this case, Caleb Dorsey is looking for 2 runaways. And he was ran the furnace between 1756 and 1772. So these are interesting documents to take a look at. In this case, there was a gentleman by the name of Richard or Roland Bates, and they described what they looked like, their height, what they were wearing, and hopefully someone would find them and bring them back. The other one was a Negro man named Tim, I'm sorry. And I mentioned a little further down that he had originally been owned or belonged to a Thomas Ringwald. So that gentleman was a slave that had run away. It was easier for white servants to get away and hide in the population than the black servants, that's for sure. Also, at the time, this is a listing of runaways from the Patapsco furnace. And again, that's going to be tough to see. The first one was these are 2 English convict servant men, one by the name of George Seymour, another one by the name of Stephen Howells, again described in detail. And this was signed by Mr. Thomas Harrison and Company. Thomas Harrison was a partner of Walker, the Dr. Walker. Dr. Walker had passed away in 1759, just about the time that the furnace was going to open, his furnace. So we had 2 furnaces going on at the same time. So that's a pretty interesting sight. The remains of that are, I have some other talks that I do where I talk in more details about that particular furnace or forge. But interestingly enough, specifically about the Elkridge furnace, a local author, I'm trying to think of his first name, Mr. Toomey. Is it James? James? Dan Toomey, I'm sorry. Yeah. Dan Toomey invited me to his house and said he had some artifacts to show me. First he showed me some Native American, and then he said, here's the pièce de résistance. And this was the Elkridge furnace stamp that he found when his grandparents purchased what's present day the Elkridge furnace in, the 2 houses there. They purchased it in 1906, and he as a kid walked around and found all kinds of stuff outside, as well as when one of the fireplaces inside the house, he found the Elkridge furnace stamp that's associated with the Ellicotts. The Ellicotts were actually the first ones to build a furnace there, so it was called it's still called the Elkridge furnace, but it was owned by the Ellicotts. Yes, sir.
Could you remind me of the restrictions that the English put on our making iron?
The English did put restrictions on making iron, but in 1750, it was 6 years before Caleb Dorsey got involved and set up his furnace. English they took the tariffs off of shipments to England. So it made it more profitable for landowners here to build a furnace, which was over 5,000 pounds to build one, and that run for 18 months. So they put some restrictions that they weren't supposed to make any more bar iron, only pig iron, ship it to England. England makes the bar iron, ships the part. That's part of mercantilism. That didn't happen as much as England would have hoped. In fact, that's probably one of the reasons why we won the War of Independence, because we had already started making our own. A good question. But anyway, the Ellicotts purchased the property in 1825, and they had a furnace in operation in 1826. So really, and the two buildings there, landscape or architects have identified the structures there as more 1900s. I'm sorry, 19th century, 1830s that they were built, not in the 1700s. But it's still a significant site, even though it's a 19th century when the Ellicotts built it. And I do another talk on that, more specifically about the iron industry. Anyway, interesting. One of the reasons why I think there's a lot of mistakes in some of the secondary writings referring to the Elkridge furnace Inn as a 1700s furnace is because when Caleb Dorsey died in 1772, one of his sons, his oldest son, who happened to die in 1777, he had built an air furnace at the landing. And an air furnace was different. An air furnace heated up pig iron and made molds, and then he was making bayonets and some other materials for the war effort. So the air furnace had nothing to do with Caleb Dorsey's furnace, but it's perhaps people said, you know, that's the Dorsey furnace, and it kind of got stuck, so that's in the Dorsey furnace all along. But the air furnace was at the landing, but not where the Elkridge, the Ellicotts furnace is. And this was a very iconic document that Samuel Dorsey's wife, Margaret, put a notice to rent the air furnace at Elkridge Landing after he had died. And actually it was rented, and they were still producing munitions up until the end of the war in 1783. So anyway, that might be one of the reasons that people misinterpret the actual Elkridge site. And as I said, he's the son of Caleb Dorsey. Yep, the older son. Okay. Jump from historic to prehistoric. The Wallace site, another iconic site in the Triadelphia Reservoir. I named it the Wallace site because one of my students actually discovered it. He was more of a bird watcher, Mark Wallace, and but I was teaching him in archaeology, anthropology, so he was looking up for birds and down for artifacts, and he actually found them at this particular site in the reservoir, and it became pretty important for a number of years that we worked there. And again, I do another talk on that, but it dated to 11,000 years ago, and we found artifacts at the site dating from the paleo, well, not paleo, that's what we haven't found, but the early archaic right on up through contact period. So the Indians were staying there, working there for 9,000 to 10,000 years. It was more of a past, it wasn't a village. We think it's more of a ceremonial site. But these are some of the artifacts dating all the way back to the archaic, all the way up to the woodland point that have been found at the site. So that's an iconic site, and lots of neat artifacts that actually, when I give talks on that, I bring some of the artifacts to show you, because they're pretty important, like the Palmer point, the serrated Palmer point. Of course, if it's a true arrowhead, we call it an arrowhead. All the rest are called projectile points, but we did find true arrowheads. And of course, I need to make a little smaller fit on that. But anyway, those are some of the artifacts that were found at that site. We call it a processing site because there's a lot of rhyolite found there, and rhyolite is found up in the Catoctin Mountains in Frederick. They would bring rhyolite down and make artifacts there and carry them on. So we found a lot of the debris from working stone there, as well as some of the actual artifacts. I mentioned that serrated polymer. And we've actually done a detailed analysis of 1,300 of the artifacts that we found within a tenth of an inch, and identified two main areas where they were working stone at the site. So I went out there a couple of weeks ago. The lake is up, so I could get nowhere near it. I used to actually fish over it. So it's a neat area, present day even, and a good area for Native Americans back in the day to fish as well as hunt. My mentor from American University, Dr. McDaniel, he's passed away. I used to take students down there, people, public archaeology in Howard County on buses to work, and he said, one day you're going to be finding sites in Howard County. This is back in the 70s. Which obviously you've seen we had. But that was a pretty neat site. This particular weekend we spent there are 800 flags where people had found artifacts, put a flag in. It took us 2 weeks because we only got down there on weekends to measure them all in to a datum. And interestingly enough, of course in the summertime when the corn was growing, it was a little more difficult doing surface searching. You'd be in the corn saying, I got an artifact, and he'd be measuring it in. So the children of the corn, so to speak. But anyway, some of the artifacts that were found there, most of them were Native American, but interestingly enough, a number of them were, in one particular area, were historic artifacts. And from doing research on those artifacts, as I mentioned before, you want to keep them all. We found out that George Washington's surveyor, who was surveying the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, was living in a cabin here, and a lot of the artifacts mixed in with Native American stuff were his, from his occupation there for a 2-year period. So that was a pretty neat site. So I'm going to jump from Olympics again to metal. Anybody familiar with that? 19th century gold coin. Basically, it was found in Charleston Harbor on this particular vessel that in the 2000 was lifted from the bottom of Charleston Harbor, and it was the first successful combat submarine in 1864. It sunk. It was named the H.L. Hunley, and it happened to sink the Housatonic, a Union ship outside of Charleston Harbor. The only problem was the submarine, although it did surface, when it went below the surface, it never came up again until 2000, when it was brought up by archaeologists. Not exactly sure what, there's some different opinions. But some of the ramming device that would attach before they would set off a charge was also found. I've been there and talked to some of the archaeologists that are still working there. And that's the spike that was rammed into the ship and then it exploded, and then they would set off a charge. The men in the, obviously, they've identified who was in that vessel, including the captain, Mr. Dixon, Captain Dixon, who had in his pocket, although that decomposed by the time the archaeologists brought this boat up, or the submarine up, they found the coin. This was a $20 gold coin given to him by his fiancée, and it saved his life at Shiloh. He had it in his pocket, and someone fired a musket. It hit him in the leg. He had to go to the hospital. He was wounded, but that coin had a nice stamp in it. I purchased some of them. I didn't bring it today, but they sell them now. It saved his life at Shiloh, not in Charleston Harbor, but that was Dixon, and that's one of the mini balls. Mini is a Frenchman who invented the rifled mini ball, or the rifled lead ball, lead shot, that saved his life. So I thought that was an interesting, obviously an iconic part. Yes, sir.
Did the state eventually get back the coin, or did the government keep it?
Did what?
Who got the coin?
Oh.
Did it go back to his family?
I think it's at the museum there in Charleston. I've not been there. I'm pretty sure I've seen it, but they have copies. Obviously, they made to sell, but the original one is there. I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
So it didn't go back to the family. I mean,
Raining Bennett was her name. That's interesting. I don't recall that, and I guess I could check. I'm supposed to go to the oyster roast the end of this month. You know, they have a big oyster roast each year, and but I can send a note, and if you give me your name later, number, I'll let you know. But I'm pretty sure I saw it there. But it's interesting you mention that because there's some. I'll get to it in a few minutes where Smithsonian had where some people could have kept the remains, but they donated them to Smithsonian. That's good. So that's a good question we'll deal with later. Speaking of lead bullets, the one on the left, they're both lead bullets. Do you recognize the molar teeth? Put a lead bullet in your mouth. We don't have much anesthetic. We got to cut your leg off. This is going to hurt. Bite the bullet. Ooh! Found on a farm in Alabama. One of my students' grandfather let us look at it, take a picture, and then he took it back. So you've heard that term. Another interesting device for killing animals, mostly the Paleo-Indian, what's called a fluted point. And a fluted point would be attached to a shaft, and a flute is known as it's just a long flake that was taken out of both sides of a projectile before it was placed in, so it would be held in tight, and that's called a fluted point. Again, I have examples of those. I'm going to do some next spring. I'll be doing some talks in case you're interested through Howard County. But there's fluted points. It obviously took a decent amount of skill, especially the last flake, because that whole point was made. The last two flakes were taking that point, turning it over the other side, and taking a flake off the other side. So it required really good hand-eye coordination, killing some of the large animals during paleo times. So anyway, we talked a little bit about how they made those tools from a larger tool, and that's losing power, working its way down to the finished product, how they took the flakes off, other iconic artifacts. And I guess, I've used the word lithic as the word for stone, and you've probably heard of the Stone Age, and of course, the time that I was talking about it, some of the artifacts at the fluted points and others at the Wallace site around 10, 11,000, 12,000 years ago. But the Paleolithic itself goes all the way back to 2 million years ago, well before they were making some really well-made flakes or points. The earliest period referred about 2.6 million years ago, referred to Homo habilis. That's the first Homo. We're Homo sapien. Supposedly the first Homo was the first tool maker. And the tools weren't very sophisticated, otherwise known as the pebble tool or Oldowan tradition, or the Acheulean or the hand axe tradition. But that was basically the first one. And that pebble tool is not going to do much for killing an animal, but it might be good for breaking into a bone to get to the marrow. And if you notice, Homo habilis, particular period here, using the hand axe, the pebble tool, there's a lot of other individuals walking around that aren't making tools, and they're all referred to as hominids, IDS. As long as they walk, even with my new hip, I can actually walk now. They walk like us, but they look more like ape, perhaps. But they were inhabiting Africa 2.6 back to 3 million plus years ago. First one to actually make the tools that we associate with present day, of course, goes back much more closely to the present. But interestingly enough, another iconic site, I guess an iconic paleoanthropologist, Donald Johanson, made a very important discovery. The Lucy fossil, which she was 40% complete. Generally, archaeologists, you're finding bits and pieces, you don't find 40% complete individual. They named her Lucy because she was a female, and at the time when he walked her into camp, the bones, they were playing Lucy in the Skies with Diamonds. So she became Lucy. And Donald Johanson became fairly famous because of that. He named her Australopithecus afarensis from the Afar Valley in Ethiopia. So a pretty iconic specimen, and she was one of the first Australopithecines that was found. And as I said before, they walk like we do. They have a carrying angle of our hips. That is the reverse of what an ape would have. An ape, that's why apes walk like so, because they don't have the carrying angle that hominids did, virtually straight. So they could tell a lot from the bones and even the footprint. Some other iconic footprints in Laetoli and also in, Laetoli in Tanzania were found. Mary Leakey found 70 hominid footprints. You can tell they have a toe just like we do. That's not with the opposable that the chimp would have. And basically, these individuals were walking across it wasn't a grassland, but after a volcanic eruption, the ash was warm, cool enough that they could walk on it, but it hadn't hardened. And that's why archaeologists, paleontologists, present day can find them. And that's, like I said, in Tanzania. Others were found up in Olduvai Gorge. So there's some pretty iconic sites in Africa that date to the earliest hominids in our history. Her husband, Mary Leakey's husband, Louis Leakey, was probably the most famous. He discovered this individual down here, Paranthropus boisei, or he called it Zinjanthropus. Actually, and I actually talked to their son. I met him at Hopkins one year, Richard Leakey, and he said that Louis was sick one day, had the flu or whatever, and Mary went out to the site that they had worked, and she's the one that made that discovery, but she said, "You've been working here long enough, give it to you." She got credit for the footprints, because she did find them as well. So the Leakeys spent most of their life in Africa looking for what they thought would be the earliest hominids, and they found them in the earliest Homo line. And again, not much of brain size, but below the waist, pretty much us. So they did walk erect, and Jane Goodall was so interested in, she wanted to work with Louis Leakey, and he said, "You know what you can do? We need somebody to go and study the chimpanzees." Of course, Jane still lived in present day. And I met her at Hopkins. I took my class to hear her a number of years ago, and a very interesting lady that obviously has revolutionized what we know about chimpanzees, and the fact that they are tool makers as well. Not necessarily stone tools, but if you can take a piece of wood or branch and stick it in a hole and get termites, that's a tool. And she made the comment that you're going to have to redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans, if you're saying that man's the only toolmaker. Or maybe man's the only stone toolmaker. Although, and I haven't brought that this time, in my part 2 of this, I've got some research that's been done with chimpanzees, letting them watch an archaeologist work stone, and then they leave the stone there, and 2 days later, the chimpanzee, the bonobo chimpanzees, is working stone so he can get it sharp enough to cut a rope to get a banana out of the trap. So they're pretty smart. Now, speaking of smart, CSI, one of the chapters in my book is on CSI, crime scene investigation. Although it really wasn't a crime scene, but a gentleman had picked up some filter at the First Presbyterian site off of 108 and dumped it in his yard, and 2 skulls came out. He gave them to the police. The police called me and said, I'm going to get out and get them, and I'll tell you where they got them at this site. And I walked out to the site and walked around. It's present day, it's that building, or that structure there is where they were digging. And they happened to incur upon I'm pretty sure a slave graveyard. When I walked down, looking at the soil, you can see some change. It doesn't show up as real well here. But there's a stain of decomposition, and I found part of you can see the discolored wood there. That's part of a coffin. And inside of, whether you can see that jaw, wow. And I might not be able to see the jaw here, but from the top you can. There's the teeth. They had been, when they were digging this trench, they had disturbed burial. Most of it was still there. We were able to excavate it and got permission from a state archaeologist to, before this building was built, to actually take it out of the ground because it was going to be definitely disturbed. So Wayne Clark came out and said, yeah, you can do that. And so we spent a number of hours excavating, drawing pictures, taking photographs before we pulled the bones out. And I don't know if you noticed the discoloration here, like a greenish. Maybe some of you have it in your basements if you have if you have copper downspouts, like you do right here in Ellicott City by the courthouse. It will stain the cement. Of course, it stains bones as when it decomposes. So actually, they gave us. They said, we'll give you 1 week before we come back in and finish digging here to sift whatever there and find out and anything else we might have disturbed. So we had time to do some work, and I was working with Dr. Lackey from American University to do some workshops for kids, and she said, you know, I know Larry Angel. You know Larry Angel? And I said, no. He's the head curator of Smithsonian. Why don't you call him and ask him if he'd be willing to study these bones, take them down to him? And he said yes. He was well known. He had already testified for over 500 cases with the FBI, etc., murder cases, this and that. He said, yeah, come on down. And I can remember walking into the archives upstairs. He was famous for his bow tie. He said, what do you think that is? It was laying on the table next to him, and I said, well, it looks like a cut mark in a bone. And he said, yeah, that is. He said, that's also to the thoracic rib cage. And he showed me another one that had a cut mark in it. Those bones and others were found. Some cross-country runners noticed some disturbance off the where they were running and saw some bones. Police came in and they brought in the county forensic specialist, and they found the remains of this person. That's her skull. And you can see that women tend to have it, their eye orbit is more like a teacup, fairly sharp. Men are a little more robust or thicker. Again, there's a continuum, but women tend to have what's called the teacup eye orbit. Plus, women have more of a vertical forehead. Men tend to have more of a sloping, not a vertical forehead. And so he was sure it was a female. And men, again, generally have more robust features, including the, as I said, the eye orbit tends to be a little thicker. The maxilla, I'm sorry, the mastoid process, which is behind your ear, in men tends to be a little larger than the females. So anyway, we had definitely a female skull. And there was a young lady who had been missing for several weeks. And a gentleman, well, I shouldn't say he was a gentleman, he was in jail, suspected of doing something with her because he had been stalking this student. And the parents provided dental records, and the flesh that faced that skull was that young lady who had been murdered. And the kid that murdered her hung himself in jail before they could question him. That's one reason why when you go in jail present day, they changed the rules. You can't go in with a belt, anything you could hang yourself with, supposedly. So that's a very interesting case, and that's the first day when I met Larry Angel. So he impressed me with how much he knew. And of course, 4 months later, he did an analysis of all the skulls that we only had 2 skulls, but we had bits and pieces that his staff was able to put together, a mixture of male and female. And 2 of them had shroud pins that were still in the skull, little pins that hadn't decomposed completely. And oftentimes in burials, they would wrap an individual, and then they would put a shroud pin to hold it in place, and that pin remained in 2 of them in one of the skulls. So anyway, he came up. He said that they were either indentured servants or slaves. Gave us the dates. And there were, I checked the slave records of farmers in that area. There were a lot of slaves in the area. Whether it was a slave burial for one particular farmer, or a variety, not sure, but the graves weren't marked, as they often weren't for slaves. So anyway, we did a report on it, and but today I think it's a pretty iconic individual, and I think it's important to make it part of this presentation. Bad news is, before I could see, he said, call me Larry, before I could see Dr. Angel again, he had an open heart operation, but the blood was tainted with hepatitis and he died. Such a shame in 1986. Yeah. And Doug Alsey is now the head curator there at Smithsonian. And the bones that were found there, the church, they asked the church if they wanted to reinter the bones, since that's where they were found. And the church said, we want to donate them to Smithsonian because you can use them to help with other material that's brought in. So that's why they're still down at Smithsonian. One that's not down at Smithsonian is Henry Box Brown. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was a Virginia slave who escaped in a box. And he happened to be in that box. It did have 3 little holes in it so he could breathe. The crazy thing was, he was in it for 27 hours before he made it to freedom. And after that became a speaker for the abolitionists before the Civil War. Tony Cohen's a local historian who was providing me with information about that. And of course, Harriet Tubman, who's obviously you've heard a lot about her, he decided to walk, give it a walk for freedom from Maryland to Canada. So he did it over several months and made it to Canada. And he also decided he was going to do the box trick without telling anybody. Of course, they weren't going to tell the train, the CSX, that we're going to be sending him to Philadelphia. But anyway, he 5 hours, it's supposed to be 2 hours, but they misplaced the particular car he was in. He had a phone, and he could pop that door out if needed, but he didn't have to. And he actually made it onto the Oprah show. And he was limber enough that he could get into that box. And that 120-degree temperature, I guess he said, was worth it. He wanted to see if he could at least repeat what had happened more than a century earlier. And one other artifact that I didn't mention earlier, this is a trade bead. And a trade bead that was found by one of my students who's now the Palm Beach County archaeologist, Chris Davenport, a Howard County guy, and he's been Palm Beach archaeologist for about 15 years now. And at one of the sites, they think this particular trade bead, they think was from the Ponce de Leon crew, was a pretty, much larger than some of the other trade beads that I showed you earlier. So that was some pretty neat stuff. So, oh gosh, I noticed people kind of nodding off. I guess maybe I've talked a little too long today. Yeah, well, I think I should end it and take questions or comments. Okay.
What do we do when we're digging in our yard and we think we found something?
Oh.
I mean, because...
Well, you can always call the, I know Howard County now, the people used to call me, and I go over and, especially through Native American stuff especially, but sometimes we get historic stuff. But the Howard Reckon Parks, Kelly Paley is an archaeologist for Howard County. You can call her number at the Heritage group. I'm sure you can get their number. I don't have it. I have her phone. I can give it to you later, I guess. But if you call Howard County Parks and Recs and ask for her, she would be able to take a look at it, perhaps.
Yeah. Is there anything, would there be anything interesting in our yards when we're digging?
Oh, okay. We lived in Dorsey Hall for, I don't know, from 88 to 2001 or so. And I can remember digging in the backyard and I found a projectile point, a Native American projectile point. And there was a Native American site on the grounds of the elementary school, drawing a blank of the elementary school, right up. Our kids used to walk across the bridge to go to school there. And now I can't. Pardon?
Northfield?
Northfield, thank you. Yeah, there was a early archaic site there. So you can find, and I used to play softball in the county, and I can remember, because they would bring dirt in from western Howard County to put on the fields, and I would find artifacts every once in a while. and teammates would say, what the heck, you're picking up stuff. So you can find that for sure, yeah. And sometimes we'll know the answer, and sometimes we won't, but then we can also send you to the Maryland Historic Trust. They have archaeologists there. Some are historic, some are prehistoric, that could help with identifying material. Yes?
I think you mentioned a mineral rhyolite, is that true?
Rhyolite, that's lithic material.
What is the significance of that?
Well, the significance, at least for this site, is rhyolite is a heavily weathered, it's not obsidian. Obsidian is a really fine, easily worked material. It's a volcanic lithic, but it's been weathered for many, many years. So you can make projectiles out of it, and obviously they brought it down from 60% of the material at the Wallace site is made of rhyolite. So they were definitely working it, and a good flint napper could work it. They didn't have any of the really good quality obsidian west of the Mississippi. So they would work whatever.
Is it crystalline? Is it long crystals?
No, no, not really. It's not a crystalline. It has what's called phenocrysts in it, but it's not a crystal like quartzite and quartz. They're crystal. They're more difficult to work than the rhyolite. And I have a little flint knapping kit that I work stone too, so I know the rhyolite's a little easier than quartz and quartzite. Okay. But as I do in some of my presentations, I've showed people some beautiful material made out of quartzites, beautiful projectile points. So if a person's really good at flint knapping, just like present day, if a person's whatever craft they're into, some are really good at making stuff. And there were some great flint knappers back in the day.
Thank you.
Yes?
It seems like the artifacts, the projectile points that I found are almost always quartz.
Quartz.
Yeah, is that because, I mean, you said rhyolite came from another place, but there was quartz here?
There are quartz, yeah, there are quartz quarries. I know there's some in Howard County more so than, say, Flint or Chirk. So, yeah, you're going to find more quartz around. Yeah, around Howard, Anne Arundel, whatever. Yes, sir.
When you were talking earlier about the ironworks, is there any evidence that the British actually came through that city at any time?
Not that I don't know. I can't answer that. I know that it seems like the munitions that were being made in Elkridge, and there was a couple other gentlemen, a guy named Russell and Hughes, that owned air furnaces, and were also making cannon for the independence, for the cause, in Frederick, and two of them rented a lot, 2 lots away from where Samuel Dorsey was. So I think they were definitely making a lot and then shipping it up. Most of the fighting was done up, at least early on, in New York, New Jersey. So I don't know of any incursions of the British coming down in the Elkridge area. Maybe in Baltimore, but not in Elkridge. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Mr. Preston. I was a student of yours at Appleton High School. I taught anthropology, and I graduated in 1979. So
I know some of the kids.
I don't think we're that far apart age, actually. So I just thought. Yeah.
I know I went to the 73 reunion of 4 months ago.
Okay.
And some of the guys said, you look better than some of my students. I said, "No, thanks, but I'm up there." What's your name?
My maiden name was Isley. It was Linda Isley.
Oh, Linda Isley. I remember Linda Isley.
Yeah. Okay. So you were a wonderful teacher.
Oh, thank you.
You really were.
I enjoy it. It's nice to do what you enjoy.
Yes.
And continue to do it anyway. Any Any other? Yes.
Are there any archaeological excavations ongoing in Howard County right now?
I know that, and again, you'd have to call Parks and Recs and ask for Kelly Malik, because they are doing some excavations up at the Tapsco Feeding Institute.
And also on a site adjacent to the fairgrounds that the county owns.
Oh.
Behind where the farm machinery.
The farm museum?
Yeah, it used to be, it's back there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's Kelly's or not, but.
It's Kelly, yes.
It's Kelly.
She's doing tenant farmers. She's doing excavation for tenant farmers.
Yeah, so Kelly Pal, P-A-I-L-I-C-H with Reckon Parks.
Do you want a phone number?
Pardon?
410.
Oh, very good.
313-0423 is the one I have. So that's her work phone. 313-0423.
0423.
Yeah.
313-0423 if you want to talk to
The work
Kelly.
that was done at the Eldridge Furnace around the work that was done recently at the Eldridge Furnace.
Oh, yeah.
On all that, that's still being processed.
Oh, yeah. That's right. They were doing some work on some of the 19th century outbuildings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know I gave one of my books to one of the archaeologists there. Yeah. Any others? Yes. Well, thanks again. Have a good day.